Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
Amir,
having
good to
me.
see you. So I've been looking forward to this conversation. The background is that with my co-author Raphael Cario, we published a paper with your center, the Oxford Tide Center, on carbon removal as an industrialization opportunity for the Global South. And we thought we'd use that as a springboard to have this conversation with you, because you're really the expert on how do we do green industrial policy in the Global South. And so I think there's a lot of different directions we can take this in, but really I want to make sure that we get your stories from what you've experienced, what you've seen work, what you haven't seen work, and then Eva and I can maybe try to draw the link to carbon removal and what we think that means for carbon removal. So that's the background. Eva, from your perspective, does that work?
Yes, that sounds perfect. Super happy to have Amir here with us.
Wonderful. So Amir, maybe jumping right in, one of your kind of key thesis, I would say, is that pure environmental policy doesn't really work. It has to be tied to industrial policy, right? So tell us a bit more, like what have you seen, a couple of examples, just so we can create the foundation for this conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you both for having me on your podcast. And I think the conversation linking green industrial policy with carbon dioxide removal will be really interesting. We're really thrilled to publish that paper, and there's a lot to unpack. So my argument is the following. Green industrial policy is a matter of survival, right? And not just in the figurative sense, but generally for many countries, especially developing countries, if they don't manage to pursue green industrialization, they will jeopardize both the climate agenda and the development agenda. But as things stand, environmental action, which of course generates a lot of value, right? Jobs, tends to be concentrated in already industrialized nations. Think about all the low carbon tech that we need for the transition. So that may create even more of a divide between rich and poor nations, which is why developing countries too need a green industrial policy to make sure they align environmental action with local benefits to sustain livelihoods. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is about, right? People's livelihoods able to bring bread to the table, but in a way that doesn't harm the planet.
So how can we, because one of the key issues that comes up in these conversations is the fact that if we envisage that certain solutions are deployed in the global south, the fear is that that brings a lot of negative externalities, and at the same time, the technologies that are being used are actually coming or maybe owned not by the global south, but rather coming from the north. So how can we approach it in a way that we tackle this very obvious challenge?
Can I ask you a question back? Can you guess how many people live in the Amazon forest?
I wish that question would go to Sebastian.
I find it a fascinating question because what you're pointing out boils down to this. So when I ask this question, especially to my students, you get all sorts of answers ranging from 10,000s to normally about 1 or 2 million.
Okay.
And the correct answer is actually close to 40 million, right? 40 million. That's basically, I don't know, 2 or 3 times Belgium in terms of population size. So if you only have environmental action that doesn't really take into account how to create jobs for people, you're not really solving the problem, because your actions are protecting trees, but not people and their livelihoods. And that's where tech comes into play. Because if your environmental or your green economy plans only relies on imported tech, it might make it more expensive for people, right, to own that tech. But you're not really providing many ways to generate livelihoods, develop supplier base around it in a way that essentially sustains those economies, right, with productivity gains. And so when you look at the green tech landscape, it's pretty shocking, because 3 countries concentrate 3/4 of, for example, renewable energy technology patents, right? And 3 countries concentrate global low carbon technology exports, which is US, China, and Germany. So if you're Uganda or Bolivia or Brazil, is the green transition basically not just leaving you behind, but actually pushing you behind because you're not really capturing a value, right? In the same way as for standard technology. So,
No, but I'm actually to kind of draw the parallel, right? Because I see examples on both sides. Like in the paper, we also highlighted the case study of Octavia in Kenya, and Octavia is actually building direct air capture made in Kenya, and 98% of their staff are Kenyan. But that's the exception. That's not the norm. Even in carbon removal, that is a very big exception. And if we look at other companies in the global south, one thing, by the way, that I find really striking, I don't know how many green industries exist where the top 4 companies in the world right now are from the global south in terms of delivered carbon removal, right? That's Exomat, Varaha, Aparam, and Carboneers, which is really incredible, I think. But those companies, in many cases, use, for example, Chinese technology, right? And so I'm wondering, is there still, assuming that most of these companies will at least initially rely on imported technology, is there a path to still kind of optimize for local value creation? Or what you've seen, it only really works when even the technology itself and all the supply chains you mentioned are hosted domestically?
you pose a great point, Sebastian, because you don't have to produce the tech yourself. And there are many ways to generate value, right? Both upstream and downstream. And I was, in fact, going to ask you about where does carbon removal fit into that picture as the work that you two have done to popularize it. And the paper that you published, Basti, really fits into the vision of what's the value proposition of carbon removal as a development strategy and not just as a climate action. So you don't have to build the technology yourself. In fact, not every country can do it, right? Because if every country does their own tech, right, it reduces market access, economies of scale, and so on. But it's really about finding out your niche. What is it that you can do yourself, and what is it that you have to import, and how you adapt the technology to your domestic circumstance. I don't want to talk about what yourself have argued, but in your paper, I think that you have demonstrated this quite clearly, especially when you have foreign tech that is not adapted to local circumstances, that is too energy intensive, right, in areas where you don't have energy abundance. And this is where, instead of innovating, you can also have a great process of technological adaptation, which is just as important, but often doesn't happen. But the broader point being that countries will need to find something that they produce themselves. And for some of them, and I'm looking forward to your arguments on this, it might be carbon removal, right? So a question back to you is, which countries do you think will benefit particularly from carbon removal, not just in terms of emissions reductions, but also as a development strategy to create local jobs, value, and linkages? I'm quite curious to hear your answer.
I think in the study, the case studies we picked were Kenya, Bolivia, and Brazil. And we didn't pick them arbitrarily. We picked them for specific reasons. And I would actually put them very high in the top countries, in my view. One thing that I find really striking is that 75% of the world's geological storage capacity for CO2, and also 70%, and 75% of the world's residual biomass is in the global south. And a large chunk of that is in Kenya and Brazil, right? Especially if you think about geological storage, you think of residues and also clean electricity, if you take the example of geothermal power in Kenya. So we have some countries, especially these 3, I would say, that have incredible natural resources going for them. And the other thing that we highlighted in terms of some of the risks associated with developing a carbon removal industry in the global south, a big one is obviously if land use, or for example, biomass use, is essentially competes with food production, right? Like this is a common concern. And when you don't have strong regulation, that can really backfire. And that's where I really like the example of Bolivia, because they actually have a law that's almost 20 years old that regulates sustainable forestry and sustainable biomass production from forestry. And that's a great example. It's actually world leading for me, the Bolivian law, to show what safeguards you can put in place to make sure that the resources you have don't create unexpected negative externalities. But yeah, those 3 countries I would really highlight from my perspective.
I would add India to that list because they also have very high level of waste biomass. But what I'm curious about to hear from you, Amir, is because of your work with developing countries. Before we get specifically into CDR, what I would like to learn more about are the steps that the CDR stakeholders could learn from, and that is how to actually like approach or give examples of the successful green industrial policy implementations in the developing countries. Like, what has worked? Is it very, very country specific, or are there some general principles that could be followed? Because then these things could also be used, or this knowledge can be used when trying to fit CDR into the picture.
So what has worked particularly well are instances where countries are building on their domestic capabilities, right? So usually they know how to do a product, and they're repurposing some of those skills, infrastructure, towards gaining competitiveness in a seemingly completely unrelated green product, right? But they're actually building on what they already know. They're not starting from scratch. The second aspect is avoiding what is often called isomorphic mimicry. So just blindly imitating the green industrial policy that another nation is doing, which rarely works in practice. Because for your green industrial strategy to work, you really need to adapt the instruments to your local context. I'll give you an example. Many countries have tried to do what China had done quite well, which is to use local content requirements in solar and wind energy projects, right? So if you want to to build a solar farm in China, you need to buy locally made solar panels, right? Or wind turbines. But when countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria try to do the same, it created a problem because you don't have the same capabilities to produce it. So actually it increases the cost of the renewable-based electricity. It makes all sorts of downstream industries less competitive. Whereas for these countries, there might be other niches, right, to focus on. And on the domestic capabilities, Malaysia today is the second largest producer of solar cells, but it built on its existing electronics industry, because the tech that you need to produce solar cells is very similar to the tech you need to build electronic circuits. Brazil has managed to produce wind turbines, but using the tech that they had to produce planes, because the tech is, again, very similar for plane turbines. So going back to thinking about what are the opportunities is extremely important for countries to really think about what do they already have and how can they turn that into a competitive niche, right? Something that they can export or at least generate foreign exchange from it as a development strategy.
If I can ask a follow-up question there, because one concept that we use in the paper that you encourage us to use because it makes a lot of sense is this concept of green windows of opportunity, right? Can you quickly explain that concept? Because I'd love to then just to assess, like, do we think the window is still open for CDR in the Global South, or if it's already closed potentially? But yeah, if you can explain that concept, I think that was very useful framing.
Well, the first question I can answer. The second one, I'll throw it back right at you. But the concept of green windows of opportunity is an excellent concept that was developed by Rasmus Lemma, Xiaolan Fu, who founded the Tide Center, Roberta Rabiolotti, building on the work by Carlota Perez and many others before. But the idea being that you have there are technological revolutions. Technologies come and go, production systems change, but you have moments when technologies are not completely mature, that you still have room for competition, but not entirely new, that they become safe bets, where there's room for new entrants. And essentially what they've shown is that basically green industrialization using green tech is or could be a new form of development for latecomers, right? They might not be able to produce semiconductors in the same competitive way as many countries are already doing it, or even automotives. But for green products, there's still room to enter, right, the field, because it is competition at the end of the day. And whether it's still open or no, first of all, there are green windows because there's such a wide variety of climate-friendly product that countries can specialize in. And some, of course, are already closed, like solar cells. The Chinese have killed the game. It's just, it's impossible to compete with China. They can produce solar cells at such a low cost. In fact, we should be all buying solar panels from China if it's the cheapest way to produce, solar power, as opposed to try to do it yourself and do it in a more expensive way. But there are still new niches. And I guess the big question, which also is to what extent does carbon removal provide such a niche, right? For countries that might not be able to produce solar panels, wind turbines, or even EVs, can they instead generate jobs and value from carbon removal? What kind of linkages are open to other sectors? In fact, the question that I also have for you is, if you're a country that wants to make the most of carbon removal as an industrialization strategy, what are the capabilities that you need to have already, right? Versus a country that would have to build it from scratch. How do you get a head start in that industry?
I mean, because we try to address this partially in the paper, right? When we say carbon removal, it's such a broad spectrum of approaches that have varying degrees of also technology, right? So one, I guess, positive aspect about carbon removal is it's done in so many different places. Using, waste biomass, waste mining tails, renewable energy, bioenergy. So there's so many different ways that kind of every country will probably have an advantage of some sort in one of them. But what we recommend in the paper as well as the very first step for any country is to do a domestic CDR potential analysis. And there's actually a great blueprint that I recommend from the European carbon removal organization called Carbon Gap. They're doing these potential analyses. They've already published a bunch for different countries. So people can look at what framework they use, what methodology, and try to do that for their country, because that will give them the answer of what are our existing resources, what are our skills, what are the other industries, as you said, right, that we've had in the past that we could actually build on top of. But without that first step, I think it's very, very difficult. And one additional challenge that I see that's different from your examples with carbon removal is where the demand is. Because when you say wind turbines in Brazil, I assume those wind turbines find a lot of use in Brazil, right? Whereas when we're talking about carbon removal, the market is probably outside, almost exclusively outside of the countries that we're talking about, because the markets are currently corporates in the global north, largely American. In future, compliance markets, probably in Europe, right, in Japan. And so this is, I think, a dynamic that I also wonder if you have examples where that has been the case, where actually the market was not domestic. So you have to have this domestic industrial policy coupled with access to foreign markets.
Maybe to add to Sebastian's take, so whilst your paper came out, I noticed that within a month, I saw in total 3 different papers come out in the topic of CDR and either the global south or developing countries. I keep forgetting where I saw the third one, and I cannot believe that I forgot. And no one has been able to remind me. But the other paper that is also very important was written by Carbon Counts. So a company where very well-known Paul Zakur works, and that has a long history. He has a long history in carbon markets and carbon management in general. And what came out from that one, and obviously, it echoes in the CDR policy circles anyway, is the challenge in these markets that Sebastian now referred to, especially, for example, when we look at the Paris Agreement and the markets under that, is we actually don't have the conditions yet to cater for many types of novel removals, because we don't have the rules in place for that. and that's hindering the process and the steps forwards. Meanwhile, we would want to see this background work taking place whilst those rules are being put in place, which we know will still take some years if you look at the IPCC guidelines, for example. And I think creating the compelling narrative that even though you might not be able to immediately, like when you get projects up and running, start selling credits, you need to start preparing for it, because we are planning here longer term. We're planning for the next couple of decades. Well, more than that. So yeah, I wanted to kind of throw that into the mix.
No, these are very interesting points. I think that in some ways, the way that you frame it might offer great benefits compared to what is referred to as payments for ecosystem services, where the idea is essentially to pay people for protecting forestry, with the idea that everybody benefits from it. The problem is it's often paid at the domestic level, at the national level, right? Governments are paying, like in Costa Rica is the most famous example. You're paying people to protect the asset as it is. But under those mechanisms, you're not managing to get international benefits or international payment from a service that is not just national, right? But the whole planet benefits from it. At the same time, the example you're mentioning, when you depend too much on demand from one place, is that there's no guarantee that this demand or the change in that, it exposes producing nations to exogenous shocks. If there is a change of, I hope that the regulations for CDR keep strengthening over time over the next 2 decades. But what if there is a massive change? How will, the industry in Bolivia, in India or Brazil adapt? The only example I have in mind is that of green hydrogen, where the demand was mostly driven by the European Union. But at the end of the day, it has led to a lot of renewed extractivism, because green hydrogen, in a way, the value proposition of it, if it's just to move energy, right, as a form of energy transport from one place to the other, the whole premise became using renewable energy from Namibia to decarbonize German industry, and therefore providing the cost competitiveness of German industry, right? But for the Namibians, it's a process that is extremely resource intensive, but also very expensive. And it's already water scarce. It's a country that is at risk of water stress. So is there a way to increase and diversify the demand for carbon dioxide removal so that people's livelihoods don't just depend on one major regulator? Or is that a threat to the industry? Is that something that has to change? And is it possible to have more demand from developing nations? Is that desirable? Especially in the world that we live in, that sounds like something to worthy of thinking about, how to not over rely on countries that might not honor their climate commitments. What do you think?
I see that as a huge risk, actually, because especially if we look today, okay, we've got a bunch of corporates. It's let's put that to the side. In a couple of years, in 5-10 years, my hypothesis is that the vast majority of demand for global south carbon removal will come from Europe, especially the way that it's going with the big commitment to international credits. And it is, I think, quite possible that voluntary market demand, for example, will be eclipsed by regulatory demand, compliance demand, whatever it will end up being from Europe. And so if you then have all these industries kind of reliant on a single demand generator, that could potentially be quite risky. How do you see it, Eva? Do you think that in 10 years, there will be diversified demand for global south removal? So how do you see the landscape?
I would try to look more broadly. First of all, obviously, there's the EU and its potential demands that it has for its own 2040 climate target and hopefully beyond, also 2050. There's the UK. Let's see how they go forward. We know that there are many, many other countries with emission trading systems that are either up and running or being prepared. We need to see if there's going to be demand from those. But then there's also the Article 6 market, right, where it's really for the governments in developing countries to, as you said, map out what is the potential in the country, what do they need to achieve their NDC, and in which areas would they like to bring in investments from abroad, and that could be through selling credits for removals. And I mean, yes, the list of buyers in Article 6 markets is not very long, but it is longer than just the EU as one. I think the big challenge might be, and the first challenge might be, really kind of driving home the fact that CDR is firmly part of the net zero math, and countries actually need to put in effort to figure out what it means for them and how they can benefit from it, because it's competing in terms of attention with all the different decarbonization pathways. And you need to somehow be able to cut through the noise and explain that CDR is so much more than just yet another offsetting project. It's something else. It's setting you up for the future. And the question is how to get that message through in the most efficient way in the developing countries.
What we've done in the paper, and also this really builds on conversations I've had with policymakers in the global south, is to not focus on the net zero part or the Paris part too much, right? But really focus on the export industry that they could build to essentially generate, cash for their own economy. But then what we've also done, especially focus on in this paper, is the incredible job creation, co-benefits for agriculture, grid stability, like all the things that you can create from developing a carbon removal industry. And in my experience, especially that export carrot is really where the attention starts. And so the kind of the mitigation element is almost a co-benefit in itself. But that's why we created this paper, because it's kind of built on what we started with, right? Like you can't lead with environmental policy. You have to lead with industrial policy and industrial value creation. And we have examples of how this can work in the global south. And one thing that I by the way wanted to say, which really strikes me from a report the CDR FOI released a week ago, right now only 2% of investment globally in carbon removal goes to global south. 2%. And at the same time, they account for 70% of delivered carbon removal. So for me, this is kind of that mismatch, again, highlights the opportunity, in my view. But yeah, I expect we're going to see a bit of rebalancing on that front.
It's funny that you mentioned those numbers, Sebastian, because 2% is also the same amount that Africa receives in renewable energy investment annually, despite having a potential for renewables that is extremely large. And this is where you have most of the people that still don't have access to electricity living, right? So that tension, that inequity, you see it across industries. But I like what you say about the export industry, because at the end of the day, for many developing countries, the ability to export things really matters a lot for their long-term development. And here, linking carbon dioxide removal as part of a broader green industrial policy is really important for the climate agenda, because it's also a powerful weapon against populism, right? And growing skepticism against climate, which is not motivated by a genuine anti-climatic or anti-climate agenda as much as people feeling left out, right? They're not feeling, they're perceiving that their livelihoods might be threatened, right, by environmental regulations. And there's another way to twist the table, right? It's green industrial policy, making sure that people's livelihood is actually improved, right, by climate action. And hopefully this is where we'll be heading.
Wonderful. Nice way to end it. I see we're almost up on time. I need to make sure that I give at least a quick shout out to the Global South Carbon Dioxide Removal Coalition, because they actually bring together all the companies doing this work, talking to policymakers across the globe. So yeah, if you are working on carbon removal, make sure to reach out to them. And yeah, Amir, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. I love when we bring in kind of insights and best practices from outside of our bubble. And yeah, learned a lot today. So thank you for joining us.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck with the agenda. You'll have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
We do.
Thanks, Amir.
Thanks, Amir.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.